This new data is showing what we know all along, that the consumer is not as healthy as everybody is saying. And with the Fed on the heels of another rate cut, is this going to deeply hurt the jobs market as inflation is going to run hot? Or is this going to help the consumer? And on top of it all, is this a correlation of the housing market? And is this why we've seen some of the worst numbers that we've ever seen in the housing market today? We're going to get into all of this and more. But first, let's dive into what we are seeing in the jobs market, because the U.S. labor market is weakening. The number of Americans in the labor force who are currently hitting the job is up to 6.2 million. Its highest since July of 2021. Now, I've been covering this for a while, so make sure you guys are hitting that subscribe button and joining me in the chat here and coming along, because as we share the total employment figure of 3.8%, it's the highest since October 21, and this is in line with levels that we saw in 08 and 2001. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I'm just connecting a few dots here. And when you look at some interesting data that shows, hey, this is in line with 2001 and 2008. What happened during those times? It's that big R word, the recession here, folks. So we've got to be very cautious when we're looking at the job market because of, quite frankly, what we are seeing. It is something to be very, very cautious about. Now, on top of it all, if these people were counted as unemployed, the unemployment rate would be 0.3% higher. The Fed will blame a weak labor market for September rate cuts. Now, as my friend Logan Matishami has said, the jobs data back to pre-COVID levels. I know a lot of you hate this report, but the Fed loves it because the Fed is going to cut interest rates. Now, we'll get into that. But hey, the under the radar number that is a huge red flag. Look, I'm not talking about your ex-girlfriend here, folks. I'm talking about the U.S. economy. So as we're looking at, hey, Wall Street's bigwigs and everything else, everybody is saying, hey, you know what? The S&P 500 is actually doing super well. The market is great. There's no need to worry about anything. Everything is fine here, folks. But if you take a peek underneath the hood, a lot of the data that we are seeing in the signals is very alarming here, right? So it's not a particular revelatory stance, but a vast majority of Americans rely on employment as their primary income. Given that 70% of the economic output is generated through consumer spending, if a bunch of people lose their jobs, spending will fall and in turn crush the economy. Yeah, it's not really that revolutionary of a thought per se, but I think people really undercut the amount of this labor force and the downward revisions. See, so we've seen a decline in the labor force participation, down 62.2% here, folks. Now, this is a huge drop. It's a trend driven by long-term demographic like aging and structural issues. Look, just a little story for you guys. I mean, the gig economy is making people go become Uber drivers, do anything else, right? And kind of avoid the full-time job. I mean, even avoid retirement. My Uber driver the other day, he's a 73-year-old man driving around Tampa because he cannot fully retire because he needs the extra income because inflation is not keeping up with the amount of money that he saved up. And to be quite honest, his S&P 500 index fund, even though it is hitting all-time highs, it is still not enough to pay for a lifestyle in beautiful Tampa, Florida, unfortunately. Now, so a trend is driven by the long-term demographic factors and then the health reasons and Crow's school remote. This weakening signaled by a stall pool of available workers. It's reduced job creation, a rise in the unemployment rate, and an increase in people who want a job but are not actively looking. The trend has implications for economic growth and could lead to the Federal Reserve to consider interest rate cuts. Now, what I think is very interesting from all of this as well is that I've been tracking the housing market. And for those of you guys who know, I've been coming back to the channel. 95% of you guys aren't subscribed, so make sure you're hitting that subscription button. But I covered this the other day on how the housing market is doing pretty poor. And we've seen some of the data come out that the amount of new houses are actually some of the lowest that we've ever seen. And it's the first time in history that we are seeing new houses being more expensive than that are being cheaper, excuse me, new houses being cheaper than existing houses. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I was grown up under the narrative, hey, the newer thing is better. It should be all fine and dandy. But what we're finding out is these new things are, pretty poor, to be honest. They are not necessarily being all peaches and cream here, folks. The new houses are falling apart. And the connection between the jobs and the housing market obviously is there, right? So the jobs market's being bad, and now the housing market is showing that. And what we saw from the housing market, housing is very lagging, right? Everything that we see from there is from, the effects of what we have months and months before, because people just don't up and decide to buy a house, right? There's a lot of planning that goes into it. It's usually the person's biggest purchase ever, right? So the jobs market revision saw a downward revision of 258,000 jobs for May and June, making them amongst the weakest 2-month period outside of the pandemic area. Now, that is absolutely crazy. And then you see nearly 1 million jobs are about to vanish from the books. 1 million is not a small number, folks. And these jobs are just magically disappearing like they were never there. I mean, what are we talking about here? This is absolutely crazy. And everybody's saying, oh, you know what? The economy is great. In 2 weeks' time, we have a 95.6% chance to cut interest rates. Now, everybody's going to say and correlate and tell me in the comments, hey, you know what? We are going to cut interest rates because of this jobs market data. But the reality is the layover effects of what we will see will not be for months and months later down the line. So if Powell cuts interest rates in 2 weeks, which looks very likely with this 95% chance, we won't see the jobs start to open up for months on end. So is it that we have Jerome too slow Powell here? Or is it that, keeping interest rates high caused this? Is this a causation or an effect of the decisions that have been made? Now, I would argue that we would probably need to keep interest rates a little bit higher in order to avoid a serious recession because of what I talked about yesterday in the UK data. So, I mean, you guys all know that. We're here for that chat as well. But we're seeing the Dixie at 98.1, which is not exactly what we want to see, right? We want to see the Dixie raise up a little bit higher, increase. We want to see that Dixie closer to that 100 mark, at least above it. And when we see the S&P 500 just under its all-time highs with this, it's showing the major disconnect that we have in the market today. Wall Street and Main Street are completely misaligned, right? So the rich own all of these different kinds of assets. They start to pile into all of their assets, and they see these asset prices skyrocket in flight. So once we start to have that, and then on top of it, we have some geopolitical tensions here, as Derek in the chat is mentioning. Well, I mean, we have, the drug war going on. The United States, Donald Trump just bombed a Venezuelan boat. So take it for what it is, but are people going to retaliate on that? Is there going to be a huge negative effect? I mean, we still obviously have the conflicts going on overseas, but this job market is scary. And what we are also seeing, right, is the cost of living increasing, right? So the cost of living for the United States is increasing at a rapid rate. Only 25% of Americans say they have a good chance of improving their standard living, which is a record low. We haven't seen data like this in over 50 years. So by comparison, it was 50 to 60% before 2020. 75% they do not believe the next gen will have a better life. 70% believe that an American dream no longer holds true and never did. So everybody is super negative on the overall economy and what we see here. And on top of it, right, we've got manufacturing. The tariffs are supposed to bring back manufacturing to the US. And what we're seeing from the manufacturing sector is that manufacturing PMI is rising. It's the second improvement, but this marks the 32nd monthly contraction over the last 34 months. I don't know about you guys, but I needed to think about that for a second to realize that's almost 3 years that it's taken there. And, we're seeing gold essentially tell the future here, right? The US dollar to gold ratio is falling off a cliff. Gold is literally reaching all-time highs, and gold is a good signal from investors basically saying, hey, we think that inflation is coming here. There's going to be a lot of geopolitical tensions. We want to get out of the dollar. So what are we going to do? We're going to scoop up gold bars. We've had central banks doing that. And the reality is central banks have the lowest amount of dollars in their reserves that they have ever had. Now, it's very interesting when we start to see that. And I think, over time, this is going to be something that, is going to increase. So we've got to keep a close eye on the gold and inflationary pressures that we're seeing because of the US labor market, right? We've seen, I've been talking to you guys about gold and silver the past couple of days and that S&P 500, right? These things are telling the future. It's the strongest bull run in decades, up 1650 points in under 5 months. Gold's year to date is at 37%. 4 times the S&P 500. That does not happen very often. And when it does, you got to raise the alarm bells with all this. Because, there's definitely going to be some interesting aspects, right? So, look, the top 10 US stocks hit 22.7 trillion market cap in August. If the top 10 were a stock market, they would be the second largest in the world. The top 10 are now larger than China and the EU stock market and are 3 times larger than Japan. So we are extremely top heavy right now. We're getting carried by a few companies, the Mag 7. And then on top of it, we have a very weak labor market and housing that is just not moving. So with the weak labor market, a weak jobs market, and housing that's not moving, you would expect the stock market to not be doing well, right? Because the economy is not doing well. Well, not so fast, my friend. The economy is ripping the stock market is ripping and roaring. But the economy is showing a lot of faults underneath the hood. And I'm going to be covering it all here for you guys. So make sure you're smoking that like Cheech and Chong and hitting that subscribe button for me. Help me get to 500 by the end of this month. I'm going to bring you guys a live stream every single day the month of September. So humor me and hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you guys all tomorrow.